My hands remember the motion better than my mind remembers the day. Muscle memory is a stubborn thing, holding onto the rhythm of the work long after the reason for it has faded into the gray fog of senility. I look at my hands now, spotted, shaking, useless things resting on a wool blanket, and I don't recognize them. But back then, in the autumn of '42, they were instruments of absolute precision. They were stained with oil and the fine, pervasive grit of the western desert, but they were steady. God, they were steady. I sat in the lee of a sandbag wall, the sun hammering down on the back of my neck like a physical weight, stripping the Windshield down to its component atoms. It was a ritual. It was prayer. The bolt, the spring, the magazine, the firing pin. I didn't need to look. I could feel the microscopic imperfections in the milled steel, the places where the metal had warmed and cooled. In Birmingham, before the world went mad, I did this with engine parts on the assembly line. There was a comfort in it. A piston fits into a cylinder in only one way. If it doesn't fit, you file it. If it still doesn't fit, you scrap it. There is a logic to machinery that doesn't exist in men. In the factory, the noise was a constant, thrumming beast. The rhythmic stamping of the presses, the hiss of hydraulics, the shouting of the foremen over the din. It was a chaotic symphony, but it was organized chaos. We were building things. We were making the future. Here in this godforsaken stretch of sand outside Alamein, the silence was the enemy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a held breath. It was the silence of a coiled snake. You could hear the wind hissing over the hardpan, scouring the rocks, and occasionally the dull, flat thud of a distant artillery piece clearing its throat, miles away. But mostly, it was just the blood rushing in your own ears. I wiped the bolt with an oily rag. The smell of the oil was the only thing that linked me to home. It smelled like the shop floor. It smelled like Friday evenings before the whistle blew. It smelled like sanity. But then the wind would shift, and the oil would be overpowered by the stench of latrines, of unwashed bodies, of tea brewing over petrol fires, and that underlying copper tang of old blood that seemed baked into the geology of North Africa. I suppose I was stalling. I can admit that now. I was cleaning a rifle that was already clean because, as long as I was cleaning it, I didn't have to look at the slit trench a few yards to my right. They called them dugouts. They called them foxholes. To me, they were graves. I tried to keep my eyes on the receiver of the rifle, sliding the bolt home with a smooth, metallic glide that I felt in my forearms rather than heard. But my gaze drifted. It always drifted. The trench was narrow, shored up with corrugated iron and sandbags that leaked a constant trickle of dust. Dark, confined, the panic started in the belly, a cold knot tightening just below the ribs. It wasn't the Germans I was afraid of. Not really. A bullet is quick. A shell is quicker. No, it was the weight. The crushing weight of the earth above you. My memory plays tricks on me, stitching together moments that might have been months apart, but the sensation of the blitz is always immediate. It comes back not as a picture, but as a taste. The taste of pulverized brick. The taste of ancient plaster and lath. I was back in Birmingham, huddled in the cellar of the terraced house 2 streets over from ours. The siren had been a mournful wail, rising and falling like a mechanical banshee. Then the whistle. The impact didn't make a sound, not at first. It just sucked the air out of the room. Then the ceiling came down. I remembered the darkness. Absolute, choking darkness. The feeling of a wooden beam pressing against my shoulder, pinning me. The screaming wasn't me. It was the house groaning as it settled. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't breathe without inhaling the house itself. I was buried. I was dead. I had to be dead. Finch, the voice snapped the thread. I jolted, my thumb slipping on the safety catch, pinching the skin. The pain was sharp and grounding. I looked up. The Birmingham cellar dissolved into the blinding white glare of the desert afternoon. The air didn't taste of brick dust. It tasted of heat and stale cigarettes. Sergeant Miller was standing over me, his shadow falling across my hands. He looked like a man carved out of mahogany, leathery, and dried out by 3 years of war. He was smoking. the ember glowing despite the sun. He looked at the rifle in my lap, then at my face. He saw it. I know he saw it. He saw the tremor in my left hand, the way my chest was heaving as if I'd just run a mile. He knew about the fear. He didn't care about the psychology of it, only whether it would stop me from pulling the trigger. "She's clean, Art," Miller said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "You rub any more steel off that bolt, it won't fire at all." I swallowed, the inside of my throat feeling like sandpaper. "Just checking the action, Sarge. Sand gets in everywhere." "It does that," he agreed. He took a drag, squinting at the horizon, toward the shimmering haze where the Afrika Korps was waiting. "Pack it up. We're not sitting in the hole tonight." My heart stuttered. "Patrol recon," Miller corrected. "HQ wants eyes on the ridge before the big push. They think Rommel's shifting his heavy stuff, but they don't know where. We're going to find out." He dropped the cigarette butt and ground it into the sand with his heel. "You're on point, Finch. We move in 5. He walked away, shouting names at the other dugouts. I sat there for a moment, the rifle heavy across my knees. On point, out in the open. I should have felt exposed. I should have been terrified of walking into a minefield or a sniper's crosshairs. But as I looked at the dark, gaping maw of the trench I was leaving behind, and then out at the vast, terrified emptiness of the desert, I felt a strange, perverse sense of relief. At least out there the sky was open. At least out there when I died, I wouldn't be buried before I stopped breathing. I stood up, slinging the rifle. The metal was hot against my shoulder. I checked my pockets, ammunition, water bottle, the small folded photograph of my sister, Alice. She was smiling in the picture, standing in front of the factory gates. I touched the paper through the fabric of my tunic. I wasn't fighting for the king. I wasn't fighting for the empire. I was fighting so that the roof wouldn't fall on Alice. That was the logic. That was the assembly line. I took a step, my boots crunching on the loose shale. The ordinary world of the camp, the tea fires, the mail calls, the illusion of safety, was behind me. Ahead, the desert wavered in the heat, a landscape of hallucinations and death. I walked toward it, floor armor too thin, suspension vulnerable. "Poor bastards," Miller whispered. He didn't stop. He couldn't. "Keep moving, Finch. Eyes up." We skirted the wreck, giving it a wide berth. It was a marker, a warning. We were deep in it now. The safety of the rear was a different planet. Here, the rules of civilization didn't apply. The only law was ballistics. We climbed out of the wadi and onto a low ridge. The ground here was harder, littered with camel thorn and sharp flint. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the desert floor. This was the dangerous time. The light played tricks. I settled into a crouch behind a cluster of rocks, scanning the sector ahead. My job was to find the enemy before they found us. It was a game of hide and seek played with high-velocity lead. I swept the scope across the terrain. Rock, sand, bush, rock, sand. My eyes moved with the practiced rhythm of a quality control inspector. Reject, reject, reject. Then I stopped. I tracked back. A few degrees to the left, there was a depression in the ground, about 400 yards out. A patch of scrub brush. To anyone else, it was just another piece of the empty desert. But something nagged at me. A glitch in the matrix. I narrowed my eyes, adjusting the focus wheel. The image sharpened. The scrub brush was too dense. Nature is random. It grows in patches, in struggles. This was uniform, and beneath the gray-green of the thorns, there was a shadow that was too straight. A line. Nature doesn't make straight lines. And then I saw it. A shimmer, not the heat haze, but a reflection. A tiny microscopic glint of light bouncing off glass or metal, hidden deep within the camouflage. It was a truck, a German Opel Blitz draped in netting, buried in the brush. It was invisible, but the windshield. Someone had missed a spot with the mud, a square inch of clean glass catching the dying sun. A defect, a mechanical error. My heart hammered against my ribs loud enough, I feared, to be heard across the valley. I lowered the rifle slowly, the movement controlled, hydraulic. I raised my hand, fingers splayed, then clenched into a fist. Wait, I breathed, the word barely escaping my lips. Dry as dust. Something's not right. I signaled the sergeant. 2 fingers. Visual contact. The desert silence is a liar. It pretends to be empty, but it is full of eyes. I kept my scope trained on that unnatural straight line. That shadow that didn't shift with the sun. Through the lens I saw the canvas twitch. Not from the wind, but from a hand adjusting a dial from the inside. It was an observation post. A forward eye for the artillery batteries, waiting miles behind the ridge. They were watching us. They had been watching us the whole time. I whispered the coordinates to the radio operator. The numbers felt heavy in my mouth. Like stone, we were calling down lightning. But the enemy was faster. They didn't need to calculate range. They had pre-sighted every rock, every wadi, every shadow in this sector. We had walked right into their calibration zone. The air pressure changed before the sound arrived. A vacuum sucked the moisture from my lungs. Then, the earth simply ceased to be solid. The mortar rounds didn't fall randomly. They walked in a tight, methodical grid, a terrifying display of German engineering. 1, 2, 3, each impact closer than the last, shaking the ground with the force of a steam hammer. I tried to scramble back to find the defilade of the ridge, but the world tilted on its axis. A shell struck the limestone shelf directly above my position. There was no fire, only a crushing wave of geology. The cliff face sheared off. Tons of rock and ancient sand collapsed in a suffocating curtain. It hit me with the weight of a collapsed factory roof. I was slammed face down into the grit, the breath driven from my body in a single, agonizing wheeze. Darkness, absolute heavy, choking darkness. My legs were pinned. My torso was buried. Only my right arm and head were free. But free is the wrong word. I was encased in the earth. The sand rushed into my nose and mouth, a dry, gritty fluid that tasted of salt and terror. Panic is a cold spike in the chest. It wasn't the war anymore. I was back in Birmingham. I was 10 years old, huddled in the coal cellar while the Luftwaffe pounded the steelworks. The walls were closing in. The air was running out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The claustrophobia was a living thing, a black oil rising in my throat, screaming at me to thrash, to flail, to give up and die just to escape the pressure. I squeezed my eyes shut against the grit. My heart hammered against the stone pressing into my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I was going to die here, buried like a pharaoh, but without the gold. Just a factory boy turned to a fossil. Then through the ringing in my ears and the roar of my own blood, I heard it. Sergeant Miller. He was screaming, not in pain, but in command. He was calling for suppression. The machine gun was jammed. The rest of the section was pinned by the sniper in that truck. They were exposed. They were dying. I was the only one with the angle. The panic wanted me to freeze. It wanted me to be small. But my hands didn't know panic. My hands knew steel. My hands knew assembly. They knew that if you turn a bolt 3 degrees, it locks. I couldn't see my rifle. I couldn't see anything. But I could feel the stock against my cheek, warm and smooth. I could feel the bolt handle under my palm. I forced the air through my nose, fighting the urge to gag on the dust. I visualized the mechanism. The spring, the firing pin, the extractor. A machine does not feel fear. A machine functions. I became the machine. I worked the bolts. The metal action was gritty with sand, grinding like a pestle in a mortar, but I forced it back. I felt the casing eject. I felt the new round slide into the chamber. I didn't need my eyes. I knew where the truck was. I had the blueprint in my mind. Range, 400 yards. Elevation, slight incline. Wind, negligible. I pressed my cheek into the dirt. I aimed with my memory. I squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into my buried shoulder. A dull thud that vibrated through my entire skeleton. I worked the bolt again. Grind, click, slam, fired. I didn't know if I was hitting them. I just knew I had to keep the mechanism working. Keep the rhythm. Load, lug, fired, load, lug, fired. I was a piston in an engine that was tearing itself apart. I fired until the magazine was empty, until the clicking of the firing pin on an empty chamber was the only sound in my universe. Then the weight lifted, not metaphorically, physically. Hands were digging at my back, rough, frantic hands. I was hauled backward, dragging furrows in the sand. I gasped, sucking in air that was hot and full of cordite, but it was air. Sweet, beautiful oxygen. Art, you got him. It was Miller. His face was a mask of dust and blood, but his teeth were white as he grinned. You put a round right through the bloody periscope, Art. They panicked. They pulled back. I looked down at my rifle. The barrel was smoking. The action was jammed open, choked with sand. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't feel my fingers. I looked at the collapsed cliff face that had almost been my grave. I looked at the distant, smoking wreck of the German truck. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a part that had been stressed beyond its tolerance. I had survived the pressure test, but something inside the metal had changed. The grain structure had been altered. 70 years. That's how long it takes for the sand to settle. And even then, you can still feel the grit between your teeth when the wind blows from the east. My workshop smells of linseed oil and sawdust now. It's a good smell, a clean smell. It smells of order. I pick up the tweezers. My hands are spotted with age. The skin like parchment paper. They shake a constant, low-frequency tremor that never goes away. The doctors call it essential tremor. I know what it is. It's the vibration of the bombardment, still ringing in the nerves. I hold the tiny plastic canopy of the Spitfire model. It's 1/48 scale. Precise. I hold my breath. The shaking stops for a second, just long enough for me to glue the part into place. Perfect fit. I have hundreds of them on the shelves. Tanks, planes, trucks, all perfectly assembled. All clean, no mud, no blood, no sand jamming the bolt. Here, in this room, I am the foreman. I control the quality. If a part doesn't fit, I file it down until it does. If a track is broken, I fix it. I spend my days building a war that makes sense. A war where the pieces follow the instructions. But I know the truth. I look at the young men on the news today, faces dirty, eyes wide. I see the same look I had. The look of a man who realizes the blueprint he was sold is a lie. In the factory, you follow a blueprint. Everything has its place. Everything fits. I learned out there that nothing fits. The world isn't a blueprint. Real strength. It isn't about keeping control. It's about what you build after you've lost it. I place the Spitfire on the shelf next to the others. It is finished. But the machine is broken forever. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.